In the days when America was still a wild, uncharted country of forests and plains and canyons, when the great trails of discovery were still to be opened into the mysteries of the West, almost all of the people, the farmers and merchants, were gathered in tiny villages, not very far from the ports where the Dutch and English sea captains had docked their mighty sailing ships. It was in one of these villages, at the foot of the haunted Catskill Mountains, that there lived a quiet, peaceful man who wore a funny stovepipe hat with a buckle on the front. The buckle didn't do anything, of course, but the man liked it there, and he always kept it shiny and polished. He was called Rip Van Winkle. It was a name his mother chose for him because just after he was born, she heard the cry of a strange mountain bird with silver feathers, part crow and part rooster, and the sound it made was very light. So, Rip Van Winkle it remained. And when he married, his wife was called Dame Van Winkle, after the custom of the time. And his son and daughter were called Rip Van Winkle Jr. and Katrina Van Winkle. Even his dog Wolf was called Wolf Van Winkle, and would not answer unless summoned by his full and proper name.
Come on now, old Wolf Van Winkle. Let's see how many rabbits you can scare out of the woods today. Or maybe squirrels would suit you better. Or would you just as soon come fishing and sit in the shade? I know a pretty good tree for that.
But Rip's wife was not the kind of woman who could let her husband slip out of the house for a day's fun. For miles around, you'd hear her squeaky voice as she complained of the work that needed doing instead. She'd stamp around her poor husband in circles, shaking a bony finger at him, her face getting all red and puffy, because she always wore starched ruffled collars that were too tight.
Now, just where do you think you're going off to, Mr. Van Winkle? You and that nasty, smelly dog of yours?
Smelly?
As if there wasn't enough work to do around the house without wasting precious time. Fences to mend, roofs to fix, chimneys to clean,
Chimney.
wood to gather. Why, the whole dreadful place is absolutely falling to pieces. And the farm. Winter's coming, you know. Can't dilly-dally round all day long. The barn needs painting. Hay needs stacking. Corn needs storing. Geese need fattening. There's bundles of work to be done, Mr. Van Winkle. Work, work, work! Oh, nothing. You think all I have to do is hop around picking up after you. Pick, pick, pick. And wash dishes and slave over a hot stove. But where are you going? Come back here, I said. Come back this very instant. Back, back, back. Oh.
If the day were cool and crisp, Rip would be off into the woods for a quiet afternoon of hunting. And if the day were warm and sunny, he'd wander to the river on the far side of town with his homemade fishing pole over his shoulder, and Wolf prancing along at his side, carrying their lunch basket in his jaws, the way he'd been trained to. Along the way, they would be met by the children of the village, who loved them both, and the children would skip and dance behind them, clapping their hands, singing songs, and trying to walk like Rip, who had a funny way of bouncing when he was out of the house and happy, almost as if there were springs under his shoes, his funny stovepipe hat sliding over on his nose if he bounced too much.
Hey, tell us a story, Rip. Oh, yeah, tell us a story. A ghost story, please. With witches and goblins. And fairies and spooks. And Henry Hudson's sailorman. Oh, Rip, take us fishing, too. We'll catch catfish and trout and stay late and build a fire. And all get scared. Please, Rip.
All right. Come along, then. But you have to promise to be quiet when Wolf Van Winkle here perks up his ears.
Yeah.
Because that means he smells a catfish. And we wouldn't want to scare any away.
Oh, goody. Let's hurry.
While on the long wooden bench outside the tavern across the street, Nicholas Vedder and Derek Van Brummel would watch the procession go by.
Good old Van Winkle. Such a way he has with the children. Have you noticed, Derek, how the dogs never bark at him? And how he teaches the youngsters to fly kites and play marbles and tells them tales of the Indians? Why, all the wives in the village have a kind word for him.
All the wives but his own, old Nicholas. Morning, noon, and night you can hear her tongue wagging at his tired ears, telling him how idle and careless he grows, that he's the ruin of the family.
And yet he never hesitates to help a neighbor. It was just last month he helped me build my stone wall, you know.
And he milked my cows when I was ill.
And harvested bomb Dutchess barley.
It's only true to say he is always ready to attend anyone's work but his own.
Well, we cannot blame him with that red-faced badger of a wife at home.
Oh, no, we can't.
But even though Rip could be said to avoid all kinds of profitable labor, no one could say he was not a patient man. For after the children had had their fill of stories and tales of ghosts and Indians, Rip would sit on the grass by the riverbank with his long, heavy rod in his hands and fish all day without so much as a murmur, even if he never got a single nibble. Sometimes he'd doze off peacefully, only to be awakened by his dog, Wolf, poking at him with a wet nose, ears perked up, as a catfish swam around the bobbing hook. Yet, more often than not, Rip had forgotten to put on the bait and the fish would swim off free, with Rip smiling a lazy and contented smile after him.
Oh, well, there's another one gone, old dog. Seems as though we do a lot of fishing and never catch any fish. Never mind, though. It's been a pleasant day without anyone yelling at us. And when we get back, I have the feeling it'll be too dark to work. Not that it would do much good anyhow. Why, that farm of ours, Wolf, is the stubbornest piece of ground in the whole country. The fences fall down on their own. The cows go off into Brom Dutch's fields. Rabbits get into the cabbage patch. Weeds grow thicker in the wheat than anywhere else. And it always seems to rain, doesn't it? Just when we're ready to get busy outdoors. It's just not worth the trouble the way I see it. And if it's not worth the trouble, we might just as well spend the time where it's peaceful and quiet.
Ah! I see you there under that tree, you worthless good-for-nothing.
Oh.
And you didn't so much as catch one fish for dinner? Oh, I suppose we'll be starving in the poorhouse if you have anything to do with it. All right, home we go. Up, up, up.
At home, he combed the burrs out of Wolf's hair and whittled a new end on his fishing pole and told more stories to his own children, Rip Jr. and Katrina, who were as wild and ragged as if they belonged to nobody. Rip Jr. in particular showed every sign of growing up just like his father. And if he were asked,
And what are you going to do when you grow up, son?
he'd think a moment looking out the window and answer,
Nothing much, I guess.
One day, in the fall, when the wind was starting to blow a bit more from the north, and the leaves were finally dropping from the trees, after changing color to red and orange and yellow, Rip was caught by his wife oiling his flintlock rifle and polishing the buckle on his hat.
Is that all you can think of doing when the storm windows need to be put up? Pottering around with hats and hunting things. You'll be the death of us all, Mr. Van Winkle, if you don't get busy, busy, busy. Do you hear me? Now, where are you going? Come back here. Get back to this house.
Rip just yawned and picked up his things and made his way over to the King George Tavern, named after the King of England, to whom all the colonies and even the village still belonged. There was a picture of the king painted on a sign outside the tavern, a man with a red coat and scepter and white wig. On the long bench under the sign, Nicholas Vedder was telling a story for the benefit of Derek van Brummel and the other men of the village, even though they had heard it many times before. All of them was smoking their favorite pipes and drinking mugs of ale.
And I've heard it said
Rip joined them
each year,
quietly.
the ghost of Henry Hudson and his crew sails up the Hudson River, the very river which he first discovered and which bears his name. They sail in the ghost of their ship, the Half Moon, until they come to a lagoon where they drop anchor. Their mascot, a strange bird that's part crow, part rooster, lets them know when they've found the place.
Where is this lagoon?
That's what no one knows. But some say it's not very far from here, and that once they've anchored, they make their way into one of the hollows of the Catskills, each of them carrying a keg of their cargo, a kind of honey and ale, with the magic of the sea aged into it. And that they play games of ninepins with huge wooden balls while celebrating their first voyage.
We wouldn't mind a little of that honey and ale now, would we?
Uh-oh, I think I hear a new kind of wind blowing. Better be off and away to your hunting grip before you're caught.
Work! Work! I'll find you!
So Rip jumped up from the table, moving faster than any of the men had ever seen him move in their lives, and he skipped away through the village, motioning all the children to be quiet so his trail would be harder to discover. He continued with Wolf running at his heels until he was climbing the autumn hills at the foot of the Catskill Mountains. He climbed higher and higher until he was away from the hills themselves, and then still higher into the mountains, thinking that this time he'd be sure to have a little peace from the railing voice of his wife. Wolf barked happily beside him, and Rip noticed for the first time that the bark was echoing in the high mountains all around him and down into the ravines and dark hollows.
Hello? Now that's peculiar. I don't remember any place that echoed in these mountains before. I must have come further than I thought. It can't be very long before evening either, when the sun goes down.
Nonetheless, he kept on, not hunting at all, but just looking at the soft purple mists that moved over the tops of the mountains, settling over them like capes in the last of the day. He finally came to the edge of a high cliff, and from it, he could see the great Hudson River moving slowly in the distant valley, flowing its way to the sea.
Here. What's that way down there in the mist? Why, it looks like one of those ancient sailing ships. I wish it wasn't so far away I could see better. Wait. The sails are furled around the big masts. It must be at anchor. No, now there seems to be nothing at all. Awfully peculiar.
The wind was growing stronger as well, and beginning to howl in his ears as the long shadows of the pine trees crept over the mountain sides, and he was about to turn back from the cliff and go home the way he'd come, when he heard a strange voice calling. He looked at Wolf curiously, who looked back at him, and together they looked all around them. but they could only see a peculiar bird that looked part crow, part rooster, flying down into a somber hollow.
This is all getting mighty strange, Wolf. Who ever heard of a bird that called your name? Where's all that thunder coming from? There's not a single cloud in the sky. Hush up, Wolf. Quiet now. There's nobody else up in these... Oh.
Looking around suddenly, Rip saw a little man who had not been there at all the minute before, coming over the top of the mountain, carrying a keg on his shoulder. The man was only 4 feet tall and had a wooden leg and a gray beard. He was wearing a striped stocking cap, red and blue, and a sailor shirt, and strange leather pants, and wooden shoes. The little man seemed to be struggling under the weight of the keg, and he sang a funny song.
Hello there. That keg looks heavy. Do you need some help?
The strange little man didn't answer. He didn't even look up. He just continued, struggling under the weight of the heavy keg, and sang to himself.
But Rip Van Winkle was hardly the kind of person to let another man, even a stranger, go without help. If it had been his own keg, he would have put it down and forgotten all about it. But seeing it belonged to someone else...
Here now, you can't carry that big thing down the hollow all by yourself. Let me give you a hand with it. There, that's better. And when I get tired, you can spell me a little. All right?
Again, the little man didn't answer. He just hobbled off on his tiny wooden leg, singing his song, and Rip followed him. Even though it was getting darker, and he didn't particularly like the looks of the deep woods they were getting into. Still, when Rip was tired, the stranger took the keg, and when the stranger was tired, Rip took the keg. And after what seemed to be a very long time, they crossed between 2 little waterfalls into a large open clearing. The sound of thunder was almost deafening. Rip was carrying the keg when they came to the clearing, and he was so tired, and his stovepipe hat had fallen so far down on his nose that at first he didn't have time to look around. But when he set down the keg and looked up, he could scarcely believe what he saw.
Why, just look at what's going on. That beautiful open field with dark green grass. Can you smell it, Wolf? It's been freshly cut. And it's all level, even though we're on a mountainside. Oh, and look! More little men dressed like sailors. They're all 4 feet tall. But how strange they are. That one has a head the size of a watermelon. That one's is the size of an apple. And see the one under the tree. Why, he's nothing but a huge nose.
And there was one who looked like a sea captain and acted like their leader. He was fat, with a white beard, and 6 inches taller than the others. And oddly enough, he wore a stovepipe hat, like Rip's. He also wore shiny black leather boots with roses on them. And strangest of all, every last one of them was playing a game of 9 pins, using huge wooden balls. When Rip looked up at first, one of the balls was rolling along the dark grass toward the pins. As it struck them, it knocked them all down, and the noise it made was exactly like thunder. But when the thunder stopped, the clearing fell into silence, and all the peculiar men stared at him. Their gazes were like the looks of marble statues, and Rip became afraid. His knees knocked together, and Wolf crept close to him for safety. But then, quite suddenly, the first little man with the wooden leg knocked on the keg, and a spout appeared magically on its side. He motioned to Rip to gather up all the mugs that were empty on a table near the sea captain and fill them. As fast as he could, Rip filled them all. And when each man had tasted the liquid, the game of 9 pins continued, and they all seemed happy again.
Here, one of the mugs hasn't been used yet. All the little men seem to be taken care of, though, and no one looks left out. I wonder if it's meant for me. I mean, why not? Might as well have a little refreshment after all this work. Why, it's exactly like honey and ale. Where have I heard about it before? No matter, it's quite delicious. I'm sure they won't mind if I take just some more.
The game of 9 pins grew louder and louder, and none of the little men seemed to mind him now that he had filled their mugs. So he drank again, and still again. He was about to fill up one more time when he noticed that his eyes were growing sleepy and his head was spinning.
Oh, how peculiar. I've never felt so dizzy before. Everything's going up and down. All the colors are getting darker. Whoops! There's 2 of everybody. Oh, I can hardly hold this mug.
All at once, he could no longer stand, and he sat down quickly to rest against the tree. Quite suddenly, he was in a deep sleep, a sleep as peaceful and as quiet as any he had ever known. When he woke up, he found himself in the same place he'd been when he'd first seen the old man. He rubbed his eyes. The sun was shining brightly. Birds were singing and hopping in the trees. And surprisingly enough, there was a warm summer breeze blowing. Instead of the trees being empty as they'd been before, they were full of bright, cheerful leaves. He hoped he hadn't slept the night away because he could imagine the scolding his wife would give him when he got home.
Wolf? Wolf, where are you? Wolf and Winkle? Yeah, boy. How peculiar. My voice sounds different. Wonder if I caught a bad cold sleeping out like that. Yeah, Wolf. Yeah, Wolf. Silly dog. Where could he have gone to? Wolf and Dear. Oh, dear. And whose gun is this next to me? It looks like mine, but it's old and rusted. And the wood on the stock is worm-eaten. I'll bet those funny little men have gone off with my dog and gun and left me with this antique.
Rip tried to get up, but he found his bones all full of creaks and aches. He could hardly move properly. And his coat was all tattered and falling to pieces. When he finally reached the place where the two little waterfalls had been, he found a huge roaring stream, impossible to cross, and no sign at all of the level place where the game of ninepins had been played.
Well, I'll just go back to the village and tell my friends about these thieves and what they did. Oh, but I know what a bawling out I'll get from my wife. Ooh.
He made his way out of the Catskills, over the small hills, and towards the village, all the while having to rest more often than he'd ever had to before. He felt like an old man. But when he reached the village, there was no one that he knew. Every face was strange, and all the people were dressed in a different, more modern style. He looked and looked, but he could recognize not a soul. Everyone looked back at him, of course. His clothes were so ruined, and his gun was so rusted. Rip finally grew annoyed that so many strange people in his village would rub their chins in curiosity as he went by, so he rubbed his own and found, instead of his usual smooth chin, a foot and a half of white beard. Feeling very peculiar about all these terrible changes, he hurried to the King George Tavern to find his closest friends. But even there, a change had taken place.
The sign seems to be the same, but instead of wearing a red coat, the king is wearing one of blue and gold. And instead of a white wig, he has a three-cornered hat. And instead of a scepter, he carries a sword. And instead of King George, it says George Washington. Now, who could that be?
Even worse, the tavern bench was not occupied by easygoing men smoking pipes. There were anxious conversations everywhere.
Well, I say it's high time the Second Continental Congress did something about the veterans.
Time, for Pete's sake. Battle of Saratoga's hardly over.
Things are so muddled, the guy doesn't know whether to vote federal or Democrat.
Oh, for crying out loud.
Rip had never heard half these words before. Federal, Democrat, Congress. He left the tavern and walked through the village towards his own house. A crowd of yelling children and barking dogs behind him, making fun of his clothes and dirty beard. But when he got to his house, the roof was all caved in, the walls had collapsed, and there was certainly no one living there. An old dog that looked like Wolf poked his head from under some straw and snarled.
Well, how do you like that?
Even my own dog doesn't know me.
Here, old man. Who are you, anyway? Coming into the village and making such a fuss with all the dogs and children.
I'm not an old man. At least I don't think I am. And who are you?
I'm the elected mayor of this burg, that's who.
Elected? What does that mean? I'm only a simple subject of the king, God bless him.
The king? A subject of the king? Why, you're a traitor to the country. Arrest him! Take him away!
Traitor? Oh, dear. But where is Nicholas Vedder? Or Derek Van Brummel? Or Bram Dutcher? They'll tell you who I am.
Vedder. Nicholas Vedder. Why, he's in Congress now. And so is Van Brummel, who served as a general at Stony Point. But Bram Dutcher was shot, poor fellow, at Valley Forge.
And no one knows Rip Van Winkle?
Rip Van Winkle? Why, of course. There he is, asleep under that tree.
Rip looked, and sure enough, there was a young man, the image of himself, asleep under a tree across the road, wearing his own cast-off clothes. Except for the hat he wore, which was three-cornered, the young man could have been himself. Rip took off his stovepipe hat and looked at it sadly. The lid was broken off the crown. The buckle was as rusted as his old gun. The crowd began to whisper about him then that perhaps he was a traitor to the newly formed United States and that it would be a good idea to get his gun away. The mayor was just about to give an order when a young woman with a crying baby in her arms said,
Hush now, Rip. We'll have you home to bed in a minute.
Rip? Young lady, did you call that baby by the name of Rip?
Yes.
Why, there's something familiar about you, too. As familiar as that man asleep under the tree yonder. Who might you be?
I'm Katrina Connor.
Katrina? Is that truly your name? And tell me then, who was your father?
Why, Rip Van Winkle, of course. The poor man went away 20 years ago with his gun and has never been heard from since. His dog Wolf came home alone, and that was the only word we ever had.
Rip's eyes filled with tears as he realized that this was his own daughter, fully grown before him, and that the child she held was his own grandson. But before his happiness could take hold, he had to know one more thing.
And Rip's nagging wife, what became of her?
Oh, she's gone as well. She wandered all over the mountains looking for Rip and died of sheer frustration.
And welcome me home, daughter, for your father has drunk the honey and ale of Henry Hudson and has slept away these last 20 years. Young Rip once, old Rip now, my lazy son asleep under that tree across the street. Does no one know Rip Van Winkle?
One by one, the older people in the village came to look into his face, and they each fell back, amazed, since they knew him under the white beard and ruined hat. His daughter died and woke up her sleeping brother. And together, they took him to the farm of her husband, a handsome young farmer named Jim Connor, who played the banjo. That very night, they had a celebration with music and good food, and a new kind of entertainment called square dancing. And it wasn't very long before Wolf came up sniffing at the old man's clothes and gave a happy bark, recognizing his master of long ago.
Good old Wolf. It's been a long night for me. But at least we won't be hearing any more of that woman's chatter. How about some fishing tomorrow? And the day after that? And the day after that? And the one after that one, too?
And And so it was that Rip Van Winkle came home to stay, free of his wife's nagging. And never again did he complain of the ghosts of Henry Hudson and his crew, whose game of ninepins, by the way, can still be heard in the Catskill Mountains if you ever go there and listen through the summer afternoons. And many a hen-pecked husband would like to join them in their game and take a sip from Rip's old mug of honey and ale.